"Daddy, why won't God let you walk anymore?" Those were Lily's last words before the crash. 3 years later, Marcus Wheeler still heard them echoing through the empty halls of his Denver mansion every December night. The blizzard outside Riverside Manor matched the storm in his soul as he picked at his untouched prime rib, wheelchair locked in place beside Table 7. That's when she appeared. 8 years old, blonde hair dusted with snow, blue eyes identical to his dead daughter's. She walked straight to his table, ignoring the shocked stares of Denver's elite, and pointed at his full plate with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Give me the leftovers," she said, her voice cutting through the restaurant's hushed atmosphere like a blade through silk, "and I'll teach you to walk." The words hit Marcus like a freight train. Every conversation stopped. Every fork froze mid-air. The child stood there, snow melting around her small boots, waiting for an answer that would change everything. 2 minutes of absolute silence stretched between them like eternity. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Marcus Wheeler had everything the American dream promised, yet nothing that mattered. At 49, he'd built Wheeler Innovations from a garage startup into a $2.8 billion empire, transforming artificial intelligence from science fiction into everyday reality. His Denver mansion sprawled across 15 acres of prime Colorado real estate, complete with helicopter pad and staff quarters. The business magazines called him a visionary. The society pages called him eligible. His bank account called him untouchable. None of it meant a damn thing. 3 years ago, Marcus Wheeler had been a father first, billionaire second. Lily Rose Wheeler, 5 years old with cornflower blue eyes and pigtails that bounced when she ran, had been his whole world. Their Saturday morning pancake rituals, bedtime stories about brave princesses, and annual father-daughter ski trips to Aspen were worth more than all his patents combined. She'd sit in his home office, coloring while he worked, occasionally asking questions that cut straight to the heart of complex problems with the clarity only children possess. December 22nd, 2021, changed everything. The weatherman had called for light snow during their drive to Vail. Instead, a whiteout blizzard hit Interstate 70 like God's own fury. Marcus remembered the semi-truck's headlights appearing through the snow, remembered yanking the wheel hard right, remembered the sickening crunch of metal and the terrible silence that followed. He'd awakened in Denver General 3 days later, legs dead from the waist down, spinal cord compressed beyond surgical repair. The doctors spoke in measured tones about incomplete injuries and adaptive technologies, but their eyes told the truth. He'd never walk again. Worse, infinitely worse, was the empty chair beside his hospital bed where Lily should have been asking when they could go home. The funeral had been a blur of black suits and whispered condolences. "She's in a better place," they said. "God needed another angel," they murmured. "Time heals all wounds," they promised. Marcus had nodded politely while dying inside, counting the minutes until he could retreat to his mansion and lock the world out. For 3 years, he'd perfected the art of existing without living. Physical therapy appointments he barely attended. Board meetings conducted via video conference. Charity galas he funded but never attended. The wheelchair became both transportation and barrier, rolling him through empty hallways filled with Lily's laughter echoing from memory. The mansion staff walked on eggshells, maintaining Lily's room exactly as she'd left it. Pink bedspread smooth, stuffed animals arranged just so. Christmas decorations remained boxed in the basement. Birthday cakes went unbaked. Life had stopped on a snowy Colorado highway, and Marcus Wheeler had no desire to restart it. Until tonight. Until this impossible child with Lily's eyes spoke the words that shattered his carefully constructed numbness. Marcus stared at the child, his knuckles white against the wheelchair's armrests. The restaurant had fallen into that peculiar silence that only comes when the impossible walks through the door and demands attention. Conversations died mid-sentence. Silverware hung suspended between plate and mouth. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their clatter to witness this strange confrontation between Denver's most reclusive billionaire and a snow-dusted waif who spoke like an old soul trapped in a child's body. "What did you say?" Marcus's voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by 3 years of disuse in public spaces. Grace Miller, though Marcus didn't know her name yet, tilted her head with the patient expression of someone accustomed to being misunderstood by adults. "Your leftovers," she repeated, pointing at his untouched prime rib, the mashed potatoes cooling in their pool of truffle butter, the asparagus arranged like tiny green soldiers across bone china. "Give them to me, and I'll teach you to walk." James Patterson, Marcus's assistant, and the closest thing he had to a friend these days, shifted uncomfortably at the neighboring table. At 35, James had served Marcus for 8 years, transitioning from eager MBA to reluctant keeper of secrets. He'd watched his boss transform from dynamic CEO to broken recluse, and every public outing felt like walking through a minefield of potential triggers. This definitely qualified as a detonation. "Sir," James began, half rising from his chair, "perhaps we should—" "Stay put, James." Marcus never took his eyes off the girl. Something about her struck him with the force of recognition, though he was certain they'd never met. The way she stood with perfect stillness despite the cold, the way her gaze held steady without the fidgeting typical of children. Most unsettling of all, the way looking at her felt like staring into a mirror that reflected not his appearance, but his soul. The maitre d' approached with the careful steps of a man defusing a bomb. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Wheeler. I'll have security escort—" "No!" The word came out sharper than Marcus intended. He'd spent 3 years hiding from the world, avoiding situations exactly like this one. But something about this moment felt different, inevitable, like a train bearing down on a car stalled on the tracks, and all he could do was wait for impact. Grace smiled then, and Marcus's breath caught. It wasn't Lily's smile. His daughter had been all sunshine and mischief, lighting up rooms with her presence. This child's smile carried shadows, the weight of someone who'd seen too much too early. Yet underneath the gravity lay something familiar, something that made his chest ache with phantom pain. "I'm not a beggar," Grace said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. "I'm making you an offer, a trade." "Your food for my knowledge." "What knowledge could you possibly have?" Marcus heard the cruelty in his own voice, saw James wince at his tone. 3 years of grief had carved away his social graces, left him raw and sharp-edged. Grace stepped closer, close enough that he caught the scent of winter air clinging to her worn wool coat. "I know why you can't walk," she said simply. "And I know how to fix it." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He'd heard similar promises from the parade of specialists who'd trooped through his recovery. Neurologists with experimental treatments, surgeons proposing risky procedures, alternative healers peddling hope in unmarked bottles. All had failed. All had left him more broken than before. "That's impossible," he whispered. "So was building computers that think," Grace replied. And Marcus felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. How did this child know about his work? About the breakthrough algorithms that had made his fortune? So was putting metal birds in the sky. So was talking to people on the other side of the world through invisible wires. Adults love calling things impossible right up until someone proves them wrong. The restaurant held its collective breath. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of stares, phones likely already recording this bizarre encounter for social media immortality. Part of him wanted to retreat, to have James wheel him out through the kitchen and back to the safety of his fortress-like mansion. The larger part, the part that had built an empire from nothing, recognized something in this child's certainty. "And what do you want with my leftovers?" he asked. "There are hungry people who need them more than you do," Grace said. "You're not eating anyway. You haven't eaten a full meal in 3 years. You order food and move it around your plate because that's what living people do, but you stopped being alive the day she died." The mention of Lily hit Marcus like a sledgehammer to the chest. No one spoke about his daughter anymore, not since he'd made it clear the subject was forbidden territory. Yet this stranger, this impossible child, had walked into his carefully controlled world and spoken the truth he'd spent 3 years avoiding. "How do you know about—" "Give me the food," Grace interrupted gently. "Come home with me. Let me show you what I know. What do you have to lose that you haven't lost already?" The drive through Denver's snow-clogged streets felt like a journey into another world. Marcus sat rigid in the passenger seat of his custom Mercedes, watching Grace's small form in the rearview mirror. She'd insisted on coming with them, and something in her quiet authority had made arguing impossible. James gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, navigating through the worst blizzard Colorado had seen in a decade. "This is insane," James muttered for the 3rd time, barely audible over the wind howling against the bulletproof windows. "We don't know anything about this kid. She could be working with kidnappers, con artists, anyone." Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't explain the pull he felt toward this strange child, the way her words had reached through 3 years of carefully constructed numbness and grabbed something essential inside him. It defied logic, defied everything his analytical mind told him about risk and safety. But logic had failed him completely since Lily's death. Maybe it was time to try something else. The Wheeler estate loomed ahead through the swirling snow, its Georgian columns and sprawling wings making it look more like a museum than a home. Security lights blazed across the circular drive, motion sensors tracking their approach. Marcus had bought the property for its isolation, 60 acres of Colorado wilderness wrapped around the main house like a protective buffer against the world. Tonight, that isolation felt less like protection and more like imprisonment. Grace pressed her face against the window as they passed through the gates, her breath fogging the glass. "It's bigger than the pictures," she said softly. "What pictures?" Marcus turned in his seat, studying her reflection in the darkened window. "The ones from before," Grace replied, then fell silent in that maddening way children had of answering questions while creating more mysteries. The mansion's interior hadn't changed since December 2021. Fresh flowers appeared weekly, courtesy of the housekeeping staff. Meals were prepared and served with military precision, but no laughter echoed through these halls anymore. No small feet thundered up and down the grand staircase. The house felt like a mausoleum dedicated to a life that had ended too soon. Grace walked through the front door with the confidence of someone returning home after a long absence. She ignored the soaring ceiling of the foyer, the crystal chandelier that had cost more than most people's houses, the original Monet hanging beside the staircase. Instead, she headed directly toward the east wing, her small feet silent on the marble floors. "Wait!" Marcus called, his wheelchair whirring as he followed. "You can't just—" But Grace had already stopped in front of a door that hadn't been opened in 3 years, Lily's room. The brass nameplate still gleamed in the hallway lighting, polished weekly by staff who understood that some shrines required maintenance even when no one visited them. "She's been waiting for you to come see her," Grace said, her hand resting on the doorknob. Marcus felt his chest constrict. The hallway seemed to telescope around him, growing longer and narrower until Grace appeared miles away rather than mere feet. "How do you know about that room?" "The same way I know you haven't slept through the night since she died," Grace replied. The same way I know you dream about the crash every time you close your eyes. The same way I know you blame yourself for not driving slower, for not staying home that day, for not being the one who died instead. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. No one knew about his nightmares, the way he startled awake at 3:17 a.m. every morning, the exact time the accident had occurred. No one knew about the survivor's guilt that ate at him like acid, the way he replayed that final drive in his mind, searching for the moment when a different choice might have saved his daughter's life. "Stop," he whispered. But Grace had already turned the doorknob and stepped inside. Marcus hadn't entered Lily's room since the funeral. The staff maintained it perfectly. Pink bedspread turned down as if she might return at any moment, stuffed animals arranged on shelves with museum-quality precision, her favorite books stacked beside the reading chair where Marcus used to tell bedtime stories about princesses and dragons and happily ever afters that seemed possible once upon a time. Grace walked to the window seat where Lily used to curl up to watch the snow fall. She traced patterns on the glass with one small finger, her movements hypnotically similar to gestures Marcus remembered. Too similar. She loved winter, Grace said without turning around. Especially the first snow of the season. She said it looked like God was shaking out his blankets across the world. Marcus's vision blurred. Those were Lily's exact words, spoken during their last winter together. He'd never told anyone about that conversation, never shared his daughter's unique way of seeing the world. It was one of 1,000 small memories he'd hoarded like treasures, too precious to expose to other people's interpretation. "Who told you that?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. Grace finally turned to face him, and in the soft lighting of Lily's room, the resemblance was even more striking. Not just the blonde hair and blue eyes, but something in her expression, a tilt of the head that was achingly familiar. "Nobody told me," she said. "I just know. The same way I know you need to start here, in this room, if you want to walk again. You can't move forward until you stop running from the past." Marcus gripped the arms of his wheelchair until his knuckles went white. "This is impossible. You're just a child. You can't possibly know." "I know because I've been where you are," Grace interrupted, and for a moment her composure cracked, revealing the frightened little girl beneath the wise exterior. "I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. I know what it's like to wake up every morning wishing you hadn't. And I know that staying broken doesn't honor the people we've lost. It just wastes the life they would have wanted us to live." The room fell silent, except for the wind rattling the windows and the soft hum of the wheelchair's motor as Marcus unconsciously rolled closer to his daughter's bed. For 3 years he'd avoided this space, this shrine to innocence and joy. Now, surrounded by pink walls and the ghost of laughter, he felt something shift inside his chest. Not healing, not yet, but the first hairline crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. December 21st dawned gray and bitter, the kind of Colorado winter morning that made even the mountains look defeated. Marcus had barely slept, his mind churning with questions that had no rational answers. How could a strange child know intimate details about his daughter? How could she walk through his home with such familiarity? And why did every instinct tell him to trust her when logic screamed the opposite? Grace appeared in the kitchen at exactly 7 a.m., wearing the same worn coat from the night before. The household staff, cook, housekeeper, groundskeeper, moved around her with careful politeness, unsure how to treat this unexpected guest. She accepted a cup of hot chocolate from Mrs. Chen, the cook who'd worked for the Wheeler family since before Lily's birth, and settled at the breakfast nook where Marcus's daughter used to eat her Saturday morning pancakes. "We start today," Grace announced without preamble, wrapping her small hands around the steaming mug. "First lesson is seeing the system. Everything follows patterns, Mr. Wheeler. Your body, your mind, your healing, it all follows rules you've forgotten how to see. Marcus maneuvered his wheelchair to the table, studying this impossible child who spoke like a philosophy professor trapped in a second grader's body. "What kind of system?" "The kind that connects everything," Grace replied. "Your daughter understood it better than most adults. She used to draw pictures of how feelings move through people like rivers through mountains. She knew that everything broken could be fixed if you found the right starting point." The casual mention of Lily's drawings hit Marcus like a punch to the solar plexus. His daughter had indeed been fascinated by connections, always asking why tears looked like raindrops and why laughter sounded like wind chimes. She'd filled sketchpad after sketchpad with elaborate diagrams that seemed like chaos to adults but held perfect logic in her 5-year-old mind. "How could you possibly know about her drawings?" Marcus's voice came out hoarse with suppressed emotion. Grace set down her mug and looked directly at him, her blue eyes holding depths that seemed impossible in someone so young. "Because I see the same patterns she did. And because someone who loved her very much made sure I understood what she saw." Before Marcus could demand explanation, Grace stood and walked to the kitchen's built-in desk, where Mrs. Chen kept household schedules and grocery lists. She pulled out a sheet of paper and began to draw with the focused intensity of a surgeon making the first incision. Her hand moved with surprising speed and precision, creating lines and shapes that seemed random at first glance, but gradually cohered into something that made Marcus's blood run cold. The drawing depicted the interior of a car, complete with dashboard details and seat configurations that matched his Mercedes exactly. But more disturbing were the additional elements. The trajectory lines showing impact angles, the detailed weather patterns outside the windows, and in the corner, a small figure with pigtails reaching toward the driver's seat. It was a technical diagram of the crash that killed his daughter, rendered with forensic accuracy by a child who claimed to have never seen the police reports. "This is impossible," Marcus whispered, his hands trembling as he stared at the paper. "The police sealed those files. The insurance company, the lawyers, everyone signed confidentiality agreements." "Patterns don't need paperwork," Grace replied, adding final details to the drawing with unsettling precision. "They just need someone who knows how to look. Your daughter saw this pattern before it happened, Mr. Wheeler. That's why she asked you to slow down. That's why she kept looking out the window that day. Children see what adults miss because they haven't learned to ignore their instincts yet." Marcus felt the room spinning around him. Lily had indeed asked him to drive slower that afternoon, complaining that the snow was making her sleepy. He'd dismissed it as typical childhood whining, focused instead on making good time to their hotel. The memory of brushing off her concerns had tortured him for 3 years, another layer of guilt in his elaborate self-punishment. "You want me to stare at this?" he asked, gesturing at the diagram that captured his worst nightmare in stark black lines. "For exactly 1 hour," Grace confirmed. "Don't think about what you're seeing. Don't try to analyze it or understand it. Just look. Let the pattern show you what you've been missing." The request seemed simultaneously meaningless and terrifying. Marcus had spent 3 years avoiding reminders of the crash, creating elaborate systems to prevent triggering memories from ambushing him. Newspaper clippings were thrown away unread. Television channels were changed when traffic reports mentioned accidents. Even Christmas carols were banned from the house because they reminded him of the CD that had been playing when everything went wrong. "What's the point of torturing myself with this?" "Because torture is what you've been doing for 3 years," Grace replied with brutal honesty. "This isn't torture. It's facing what happened instead of running from it. You can't heal from something you won't acknowledge." James appeared in the kitchen doorway, tablet in hand and expression carefully neutral. Marcus's assistant had perfected the art of managing his boss's moods, but this situation clearly lay outside his expertise. "Sir, your 9 o'clock conference call with the Singapore office—" "Cancel it," Marcus interrupted, not taking his eyes off the drawing. "Cancel everything today." "But the quarterly projections—" "I said cancel everything, James." The edge in Marcus's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Unless the world is ending, I don't want to hear about business today." James hesitated, clearly wrestling with the wisdom of leaving his volatile boss alone with a strange child and a traumatic diagram. But Marcus's tone brooked no argument. With visible reluctance, James retreated to make the necessary calls. Grace moved to the kitchen's large window, positioning herself where she could observe without intrusion. "Start now," she said simply. "1 hour. Just you and the pattern." Marcus positioned his wheelchair directly in front of the paper, close enough to see every pencil stroke. At first, the drawing seemed like nothing more than a cruel reminder of his worst day. The technical precision made it worse somehow. This wasn't abstract art that allowed for interpretation, but a forensic recreation that left no room for denial or wishful thinking. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Marcus's instinct was to look away, to crumple the paper and throw it in the fireplace where it belonged. But something in Grace's quiet presence kept him focused on the image. She stood perfectly still by the window, occasionally tracing patterns in the condensation with her finger, but otherwise giving him space to process whatever was supposed to happen. Gradually, Marcus began to notice details he'd missed in his initial horror. The trajectory lines weren't just random marks. They showed multiple possible paths the car could have taken, including several that would have avoided impact altogether. The weather patterns revealed wind directions that might have explained why the semi-truck had drifted into their lane. Most importantly, the small figure reaching toward the driver's seat wasn't trying to grab the wheel. She was trying to comfort her father. She wasn't scared, Marcus said aloud, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. At the end, she wasn't trying to take control or panic. She was trying to help me. Grace nodded without turning from the window. Children don't think about dying the way adults do. She thought about loving you. That's why she reached toward you instead of away from the danger. The insight cracked something fundamental in Marcus's chest. For 3 years he'd tormented himself with images of Lily's final moments, convinced she must have been terrified and alone. The possibility that her last act had been one of love rather than fear shifted his entire understanding of that terrible day. "But she still died because of my choices," he said, the words scraping against his throat. "She died because of weather and timing and metal and physics," Grace replied, finally turning to face him. "The only choice that mattered was the one she made in that last second, to reach for you instead of away from you. She chose love over fear. That's the pattern you need to see." Marcus stared at the drawing for the remaining 40 minutes with different eyes. Instead of a diagram of failure and guilt, it became something else entirely, a testament to connection that transcended even death. When Grace finally told him the hour was complete, he felt hollowed out but strangely lighter, as if some toxic weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "What happens now?" he asked. Grace folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. "Now we work on lesson 2. But first, you need to eat something, real food this time, not the pretend eating you've been doing." She was right, Marcus realized. The act of sitting with his trauma, really examining it instead of fleeing from it, had awakened something that felt suspiciously like appetite. For the first time in 3 years, the thought of food didn't make him nauseous. Mrs. Chen materialized with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, simple fare that seemed impossibly appealing after months of untouched gourmet meals. Marcus ate slowly, tasting each bite with the concentration of someone rediscovering a forgotten skill. Grace watched approvingly, occasionally offering commentary that showed disturbing insight into his psychological state. Your body shut down because your mind decided you didn't deserve to feel good, she observed as he finished the last bite. But your daughter would want you to feel good. She'd want you to taste your food and enjoy sunny days and laugh at silly jokes. Staying numb doesn't honor her memory. It wastes the life she would have wanted you to keep living. The simple truth of it was devastating in its clarity. Marcus had confused self-punishment with love, believing that suffering somehow kept Lily's memory alive. But his daughter had been joy incarnate, delighting in everything from bubble baths to ice cream cones to bedtime stories that ended with everyone living happily ever after. She would have been heartbroken to know her death had drained all pleasure from her father's existence. Lesson 2 starts after lunch, Grace announced, already moving toward the kitchen door. We're going to your gym. Marcus felt his stomach clench. He hadn't entered the mansion's elaborate fitness center since before the accident, couldn't bear the sight of equipment designed for a body that no longer obeyed his commands. I don't think... That's the problem, Grace interrupted gently. You think too much and feel too little. This afternoon, we're going to reverse that. She disappeared into the house's interior, leaving Marcus alone with the lingering taste of eggs and the unsettling certainty that his carefully controlled world was about to be turned completely upside down. The gymnasium had been Marcus's pride before the accident, a 15,000-square-foot temple to physical excellence tucked into the mansion's south wing. Olympic-grade equipment gleamed under professional lighting, rowing machines that had never known sweat, weight stations gathering dust like monuments to abandoned ambition, a regulation basketball court where no ball had bounced in 3 years. The space felt less like a gym than a museum dedicated to the man Marcus used to be. Grace walked ahead of him through the double doors, her small footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She moved with purpose, ignoring the sophisticated machinery to focus on a simple mat in the center of the room, the kind of basic exercise mat that cost $30 at any sporting goods store, utterly unremarkable among equipment worth more than most people's annual salaries. "Take off your shirt," she said without preamble, settling cross-legged on the mat. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Absolutely not. That's completely inappropriate, and I won't—" "Your shirt, not your dignity," Grace interrupted, her tone carrying the patient authority of someone accustomed to adult resistance. "You can't feel what your body is trying to tell you when you're wrapped up in barriers. The shirt is just another wheelchair." The comparison stung because it rang true. Marcus had spent 3 years layering himself in protective armor. Formal clothes that maintained distance, chairs that controlled his positioning, routines that eliminated spontaneity. Each barrier had seemed necessary for survival, but collectively they'd created a prison more confining than his physical limitations. With reluctance that felt like stepping off a cliff, Marcus pulled his sweater over his head. The gym's air felt cold against skin that rarely saw light, and he was acutely aware of the muscle atrophy that 3 years of inactivity had carved into his frame. Where once he'd maintained the physique of someone who treated his body like a precision instrument, now he saw the soft deterioration of neglect. "Now what?" he asked, voice tight with embarrassment. "Now you get out of that chair and onto the floor." The request hit Marcus like a physical blow. His wheelchair had become more than mobility assistance. It was his throne, his barrier, his identity. The thought of abandoning it, even temporarily, triggered waves of anxiety that made his chest tight and his breathing shallow. "I can't," he said simply. "Can't or won't." Grace's blue eyes held no judgment, only curiosity. Marcus considered the question with the analytical mind that had built his fortune. Technically, he retained enough upper body strength to transfer from chair to floor. His doctors had confirmed that his arms and torso were unaffected by the spinal injury. The paralysis was complete from the waist down, but that still left half his body functional. The barrier wasn't physical incapacity. It was the terror of being that vulnerable, that exposed. "I'll fall," he admitted. "Yes," Grace agreed matter-of-factly. "Probably several times. That's how learning works. Babies fall hundreds of times before they walk. You think you're different because you're rich?" The blunt assessment cut through his self-pity like a scalpel. Marcus had convinced himself that his grief was somehow more profound than other people's losses, that his disability was more tragic because he'd fallen from greater heights. But gravity didn't care about bank accounts, and bones broke the same way whether you lived in a mansion or a trailer. With movements that felt like betraying everything he'd become, Marcus engaged the wheelchair's brake and began the awkward process of transferring to the mat. His arms shook with the effort, 3 years of limited use making the simple motion feel mountainous. Grace watched without offering help, somehow understanding that assistance would rob him of necessary agency. The mat felt impossibly far from the safety of his chair. Without the familiar framework of wheels and armrests, Marcus felt unmoored, like an astronaut whose tether had snapped. The gym's ceiling soared above him, emphasizing his position at ground level where he hadn't been since those first terrible days in the hospital. "How does it feel?" Grace asked. "Terrifying," Marcus answered honestly. "Good. Terror means you're alive. You've been so numb you forgot what feeling scared was like." Grace moved closer, positioning herself where he could see her clearly. "Now I want you to crawl." The word hit Marcus like a slap. Crawling was for infants, for animals, for broken things that couldn't achieve proper human locomotion. The thought of reducing himself to that level of primitive movement violated everything his pride had left intact. "I won't do that," he said flatly. "Why not?" "Because it's degrading. Because I'm not an animal." Grace tilted her head with the expression she wore when adults said something particularly foolish. Animals are honest about what their bodies can do. They don't pretend to be something they're not because of pride. A wolf with a broken leg doesn't refuse to limp. It adapts. It finds new ways to hunt, new ways to survive. Pride is what kills them, not injury. The comparison to wounded animals felt apt in ways Marcus didn't want to acknowledge. He'd spent 3 years refusing to adapt, clinging to the ghost of who he used to be rather than discovering who he might become. The wheelchair had become his denial made manifest, a way of maintaining the illusion of dignity while avoiding the messy work of actual recovery. "I don't know how," he admitted, the words scraping against his throat like gravel. "Yes, you do. Every human knows how to crawl. It's programmed into us before we ever learn to walk. You've just forgotten because you decided it was beneath you." Grace demonstrated, moving across the mat on hands and knees with fluid grace. "It's not about speed or looking pretty. It's about connecting with your body again, feeling how it wants to move instead of forcing it into shapes that don't work anymore." Marcus stared at the mat stretching before him like an ocean of humiliation. Every instinct screamed against lowering himself to this level, against abandoning the last vestiges of the successful man he'd once been. But beneath the pride and fear, something else stirred. Curiosity about what his body might be capable of if he stopped limiting it to wheelchair-bound expectations. The first attempt was disaster. Marcus pitched forward without grace, catching himself on his forearms in a movement that sent shockwaves through muscles that had forgotten what effort felt like. His legs dragged uselessly behind him, dead weight that made every inch of progress a monumental achievement. "Don't think about your legs," Grace coached from nearby. "Think about your arms, your shoulders, your core. Think about moving towards something you want instead of away from something you hate." Marcus tried again, this time focusing on the mechanics of upper body movement rather than the shame of his position. His arms found rhythm, pulling his torso forward while his abs engaged to maintain stability. It wasn't walking, wasn't even close, but it was movement, progress, proof that his body retained capabilities beyond mere existence. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the gym's climate control. Muscles that had atrophied during 3 years of minimal use burned with the sweet agony of reactivation. Each movement forward felt like reclaiming territory that had been abandoned rather than lost. "There," Grace said with satisfaction as Marcus completed his first crossing of the mat. "Now you remember." Marcus rolled onto his back, chest heaving from exertion that would have been trivial before his accident. But instead of defeat, he felt something unexpected: accomplishment. He'd moved under his own power, covered distance through his own effort rather than mechanical assistance. "What did I remember?" he asked between labored breaths. "That your body is more than the parts that don't work," Grace replied. "That movement is about going somewhere you want to be, not running from where you are. That strength isn't about perfection. It's about using what you have instead of mourning what you lost." Marcus stared at the gym's ceiling, feeling the burn in his arms and shoulders like a forgotten language returning to fluency. For 3 years, he'd defined himself by limitation: what he couldn't do, where he couldn't go, who he could no longer be. But crawling across this mat had revealed a different truth. He was still capable of effort, still able to generate forward momentum through will and determination. "Lesson 2 is complete," Grace announced, standing and brushing off her jeans. "Tomorrow we work on standing." "Standing?" Marcus felt his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. "I can't stand. The doctors were very clear about—" "The doctors told you what your legs can't do," Grace interrupted. "They didn't tell you what your spirit can do. There's a difference." She walked toward the gym's exit, leaving Marcus alone on the mat with the lingering burn of exertion and the unsettling certainty that she was about to prove the impossible possible once again. December 24th arrived with the kind of crystalline silence that only came after heavy snowfall. Marcus woke before dawn, his body aching in places that had been numb for 3 years. The previous 2 days of Grace's unconventional therapy had awakened nerve pathways he'd assumed were permanently severed, not through miraculous healing, but through the simple act of demanding his body remember what it was capable of doing. Grace appeared in the kitchen as punctually as she had the previous mornings, but today something was different. She carried herself with an energy that seemed to vibrate just beneath her skin, and her blue eyes held anticipation that made Marcus's stomach clench with anxiety. "Final lesson," she announced without preamble, wrapping her small hands around the mug of hot chocolate Mrs. Chen provided. "Today you fly." Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your helicopter," Grace said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather rather than proposing something that violated every safety protocol he'd established since the accident. "You're going to pilot it today." The suggestion was so absurd it took Marcus several seconds to formulate a response. His Sikorsky S-76 sat in the hangar behind the estate, maintained by a full-time mechanic but untouched by Marcus since the crash. Flying required precise foot controls for rudder and collective pitch, functions that demanded the very mobility he'd lost. The idea of attempting to pilot without full leg function wasn't just impossible. It was suicidal. "That's completely insane," Marcus said finally. "I can't operate the rudder pedals. I can't feel my feet. Do you want to kill us both?" Grace studied him with that unsettling intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "You've been killing yourself slowly for 3 years. At least this way would be quick." The casual mention of his slow-motion suicide hit Marcus like a physical blow. She was right, of course. He'd been systematically destroying himself through isolation and self-neglect, choosing gradual dissolution over the messier business of actually living. But the thought of dying in a helicopter crash, of recreating the vehicular violence that had claimed his daughter, filled him with terror that made his hands shake. "I won't do it," he said flatly. "Why not?" "Because it's dangerous. Because I'm not qualified. Because it would be irresponsible and stupid and—" "Because you're scared," Grace interrupted, her voice gentle but implacable. Marcus felt his defensive walls slam into place. "I'm not scared, I'm practical. There's a difference between courage and reckless endangerment." "Is there?" Grace tilted her head with that maddening expression she wore when dissecting adult reasoning. "You've spent 3 years avoiding every risk, every challenge, every opportunity to discover what you might be capable of. You call it being practical, but it looks like fear from where I'm sitting." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Marcus had indeed retreated from anything that might threaten his carefully constructed safety, building elaborate barriers between himself and potential failure. He'd convinced himself this was wisdom born of experience, but Grace's blunt assessment suggested something far less noble: cowardice masquerading as prudence. "Even if I wanted to try," Marcus said, grasping for rational objections, "the weather is terrible. The snow, the wind. No sane pilot would take off in these conditions." Grace moved to the kitchen window and pressed her face against the glass. Outside, the storm that had been battering Denver for 3 days showed signs of clearing. Patches of blue appeared between the gray clouds, and the wind that had been howling around the mansion's corners had settled into sporadic gusts. "Weather's breaking," she observed, "and besides, you've flown in worse conditions. You used to take business trips in weather that grounded commercial flights. You used to say that successful people couldn't afford to wait for perfect conditions." Again, the casual knowledge of his past behavior sent chills down Marcus's spine. He had indeed been known for taking calculated risks that other executives avoided, using superior equipment and skills to maintain competitive advantages. But that had been before the accident, before he'd learned that confidence could be shattered as easily as spinal vertebrae. "That was different," Marcus protested. "I was different." "You were walking," Grace corrected. "But walking was never what made you brave. Walking was just how you got to the places where you showed courage." "The courage was always inside you. It didn't live in your legs." The distinction was subtle but profound. Marcus had conflated physical capability with personal strength, assuming that losing mobility meant losing everything that had made him formidable. But Grace was suggesting that his essential nature, the drive and determination that had built an empire, remained intact despite his physical limitations. "What if I crash?" Marcus asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "What if you don't?" Grace countered. "What if you discover that you're still the man who built something from nothing? What if you learn that broken doesn't mean defeated?" Marcus stared out at the clearing sky, watching snow devils dance across the estate's grounds. The helicopter sat in its hangar like a sleeping giant, waiting for someone with sufficient courage to wake it. For 3 years, he'd told himself that some risks weren't worth taking, that some dreams were better left abandoned. But sitting in this kitchen with a child who seemed to see possibilities where he saw only obstacles, Marcus felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought was dead forever: the hunger to prove what he was capable of. "The adaptive controls were never installed," he said weakly. "The manufacturer recommended modifications for pilots with limited leg function, but I never followed through." "Adaptive controls are for people who need them," Grace replied. "Maybe you don't need them as much as you think." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, the kitchen door opened, and James entered with his tablet and the carefully neutral expression that meant bad news. Marcus's assistant had perfected the art of delivering uncomfortable information without triggering his boss's volatile moods, but today his diplomatic skills seemed strained. "Sir," James began hesitantly, "I've received several calls from Dr. Kane's office. He's quite concerned about your unconventional therapeutic approach. He's requested an immediate consultation to assess your psychological state." Marcus felt cold certainty settle in his stomach. Dr. Vincent Kane had been his neurologist since the accident, the man who'd delivered the original diagnosis of permanent paralysis with clinical detachment. Kane represented the medical establishment's verdict on Marcus's future: limited, predictable, safely contained within accepted parameters. The thought of the doctor arriving to interrupt Grace's unorthodox methods filled Marcus with protective fury he hadn't experienced since the accident. "Tell Dr. Kane that his services are no longer required," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded boardrooms. "I'm exploring alternative treatment options." James shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, he mentioned that he might need to involve adult protective services if he believes you're being exploited or manipulated. He seemed particularly concerned about your interaction with an unaccompanied minor." The threat was clear: conform to medical expectations or face intervention that could remove his autonomy entirely. Marcus looked at Grace, who met his gaze with calm certainty that seemed to say the choice was entirely his. He could retreat to the safety of approved treatments and gradual decline, or he could risk everything on the possibility that he was capable of more than anyone imagined. "James," Marcus said slowly, "prepare the helicopter for flight. And if Dr. Kane shows up uninvited, call security." The helicopter hangar felt like a cathedral dedicated to abandoned dreams. Marcus's Sikorsky S-76 sat in pristine condition, its black and silver paint gleaming under industrial lighting that hadn't illuminated an actual flight in 3 years. The aircraft represented everything he'd lost: freedom, mobility, the intoxicating rush of controlling powerful machinery through skill and will alone. Now it stood as a monument to the man he used to be, maintained at considerable expense by staff who understood that some shrines required upkeep even when their gods had fallen silent. Grace walked around the helicopter with the focused attention of a mechanic conducting pre-flight inspection. Her small hands traced the landing skids, examined the rotor blades, tested the door handles with methodical precision that seemed impossible in someone her age. Marcus watched from his wheelchair, fighting waves of anxiety that made his chest tight and his breathing shallow. "She's beautiful," Grace said, running her palm along the aircraft's smooth fuselage. "Your daughter loved flying with you. She said it made her feel like a princess in a castle that could touch the clouds." The casual reference to Lily's exact words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His daughter had indeed described their flights in precisely those terms, delighting in the bird's-eye view of Colorado's mountains and valleys. The memory was so specific, so intimate, that Marcus felt his vision blur with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in months. "How do you know that?" he whispered. Grace turned to face him, her blue eyes holding depths that seemed to contain decades of accumulated wisdom. "Because someone who loved her very much made sure I understood what flying meant to your family. Made sure I knew how much joy you found in being above the world together." Before Marcus could demand further explanation, the hangar doors burst open with a violence that made both of them jump. Dr. Vincent Kane strode through the entrance like an avenging angel, his silver hair disheveled and his usually immaculate suit wrinkled from what appeared to be a hurried drive through treacherous weather. Behind him came 2 men in dark suits who radiated the quiet authority of government officials. "This madness stops now," Kane announced, his voice echoing off the hangar's steel walls. "Mr. Wheeler, you're clearly experiencing a psychological break that's put both you and this child in danger." Marcus felt his protective instincts flare with surprising intensity. Whatever Grace's true identity or purpose, she'd shown him possibilities he'd thought were lost forever. The idea of Kane's clinical coldness destroying that fragile hope filled him with rage he hadn't experienced since the accident. "Dr. Kane," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded boardrooms full of skeptical investors, "you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave immediately." "I'm here as your physician and as a concerned citizen," Kane replied, pulling out his phone to document the scene. "You're being manipulated by an unaccompanied minor of unknown background who's convinced you to attempt dangerous activities far beyond your current capabilities. I have a legal obligation to protect you from exploitation." The word exploitation hit Marcus like a slap. Kane was reducing Grace to a predator and himself to a helpless victim, stripping away the agency he'd fought so hard to reclaim. The clinical assessment ignored everything he'd accomplished over the past 3 days: the breakthrough moments of connection, the rediscovery of physical capabilities, the first stirrings of hope he'd felt since Lily's death. "This child hasn't exploited anyone," Marcus said, maneuvering his wheelchair to position himself between Grace and the intruders. "She's helped me remember what I'm capable of." "What you're capable of," Kane repeated with the patient tone reserved for delusional patients, "is catastrophic injury or death. You're proposing to pilot a complex aircraft without proper leg function in marginal weather conditions. That's not courage, Mr. Wheeler. It's suicide with extra steps." One of the suited men stepped forward, pulling out credentials that identified him as Agent Morrison from Adult Protective Services. "Sir, we've received reports of a minor child being placed in potentially dangerous situations by an adult whose judgment may be compromised by grief and trauma. We need to speak with the child privately to assess her well-being." Grace moved closer to Marcus's wheelchair, her small hand resting on his armrest with surprising steadiness. "I'm not in danger," she said clearly, her young voice carrying remarkable authority. "Mr. Wheeler has been nothing but kind to me. He's learning to be brave again, and that scares some people because they've forgotten what courage looks like." Kane knelt to Grace's eye level with the practiced bedside manner that had made him Denver's most respected neurologist. "Sweetheart, adults sometimes make promises they can't keep when they're hurting inside. Mr. Wheeler might believe he can fly this helicopter, but his body simply isn't capable of operating the controls safely. He could crash and hurt both of you very badly." "His body is more capable than you told him it was," Grace replied with devastating simplicity. "You said he'd never walk again, but he walked yesterday. You said he'd never feel his legs again, but he can feel them now. Maybe you were wrong about other things too." Marcus felt his world tilt slightly off its axis. The casual mention of sensation in his legs should have been impossible. He'd accepted complete paralysis as medical fact for 3 years. But as Grace spoke, he realized he had indeed been feeling phantom sensations during their sessions, tingles and pressure he'd dismissed as wishful thinking rather than potential recovery. Kane's confident expression faltered for the first time since entering the hangar. "That's impossible. The MRI scans clearly show complete spinal cord transection. There's no mechanism for sensation to return after such extensive damage." "Maybe the scans were wrong," Grace suggested with the matter-of-fact tone children used when stating obvious truths adults preferred to ignore. "Maybe the damage wasn't as bad as everyone assumed. Maybe Mr. Wheeler's body knows how to heal better than the tests predicted." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to everything the medical establishment had pronounced about Marcus's condition. Kane pulled out his tablet, scrolling through digital files with the frantic energy of someone whose expertise was being questioned by a child. "The imaging is definitive," he insisted, showing grainy scan images to Agent Morrison. "Complete transection at L2, L3, total loss of sensation and motor function below the point of injury. Recovery is medically impossible." Marcus stared at the scans that had defined his reality for 3 years, but for the first time he noticed details that seemed inconsistent with Kane's interpretation. The supposed complete transection looked more like severe compression, with spinal cord tissue that appeared damaged but not entirely severed. The images were grainy, taken during emergency treatment when precise positioning would have been difficult. These scans were taken immediately after my accident, Marcus said slowly, a terrible suspicion beginning to form. During trauma surgery when I was unstable, were follow-up scans ever performed to assess healing progression? Kane's hesitation was answer enough. For 3 years, Marcus had been living with a diagnosis based on emergency imaging rather than comprehensive evaluation. The medical team had pronounced his condition hopeless based on worst-case scenario assumptions rather than rigorous ongoing assessment. Dr. Kane, Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet, are you telling me that my paralysis diagnosis was based on 3-year-old emergency scans without follow-up evaluation? Standard protocol for complete spinal transection doesn't require... Kane began. Answer the question. Have you performed updated imaging to confirm the extent of my injury since those initial scans? Kane's face had gone pale beneath his professional composure. Your condition was considered stable. Additional imaging would have been unnecessarily expensive without therapeutic benefit. The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. For 3 years, he'd lived as a prisoner of a diagnosis that might have been incorrect from the beginning. Kane had essentially written him off based on emergency room assumptions, never bothering to verify whether recovery might be possible with proper treatment and rehabilitation. Grace stepped closer to the helicopter, her small hand resting on the door handle with casual familiarity. Mr. Wheeler doesn't need permission to discover what he's capable of. He needs the courage to try. And maybe some people are scared of what might happen if he succeeds. Kane lunged forward as if to grab Grace away from the aircraft. But Marcus intercepted him with surprising speed, his wheelchair blocking the doctor's path. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across 3 years of accumulated frustration and broken trust. Get out, Marcus said quietly. All of you, get out of my hangar, off my property, and out of my life. I'm done being told what I can't do by people who never bothered to find out what I could do. Agent Morrison stepped forward with bureaucratic determination. Sir, I still need to interview the child to ensure her safety. The child is safer with me than she'd be in whatever system you represent, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the steel that had built an empire. I have enough lawyers to make your life very complicated if you continue this harassment. I suggest you find actual cases of abuse to investigate instead of manufacturing crises where none exist. The threat carried enough credibility to make Morrison reconsider his approach. Marcus Wheeler's legal team was legendary for their ruthlessness, and tangling with them over a questionable intervention would likely end badly for everyone involved except the lawyers. Kane made one final attempt at medical authority. Mr. Wheeler, if you attempt to fly in your condition, I'll have no choice but to report it as a suicide attempt. The FAA will revoke your pilot's license permanently. Then I guess I'd better not crash, Marcus replied, reaching for the helicopter's door handle with steady hands that surprised him with their lack of trembling. As Kane and his companions retreated to their vehicles with muttered threats about lawsuits and professional standards, Marcus found himself alone in the hangar with Grace and a machine that represented either salvation or destruction. The choice was entirely his, and for the first time in 3 years, that felt like freedom rather than burden. The helicopter's interior felt like stepping into a time capsule. Every control, every gauge, every familiar surface transported Marcus back to the man he'd been before the world collapsed around him. His hands moved automatically to the pre-flight checklist, muscle memory overriding 3 years of disuse as he began the methodical process of preparing the aircraft for flight. Grace settled into the co-pilot seat with the calm assurance of someone who belonged there, her small hands folding neatly in her lap as she watched Marcus work through the startup sequence. The helicopter's turbines whined to life, their familiar song awakening something primal in Marcus's chest, a hunger for altitude and speed that had been dormant but never truly dead. You remember, Grace observed as Marcus's fingers danced across switches and dials with practiced precision. It's like riding a bicycle, Marcus replied, though his voice carried uncertainty he couldn't quite suppress. The knowledge is still there, whether I can actually execute it. He let the sentence hang unfinished as he reached for the collective pitch control with his left hand and the cyclic with his right. These were the controls that would translate his intentions into flight, the delicate instruments that required precise coordination between mind and machine. But it was the anti-torque pedals at his feet that represented the true test, controls that demanded the very leg function Dr. Kane insisted he'd lost forever. Marcus pressed his feet against the pedals, expecting nothing. For 3 years, he'd accepted the complete absence of sensation below his waist as immutable medical fact. But as his feet made contact with the controls, something extraordinary happened. He felt them. Not the full sensation he'd once known, but unmistakable pressure and position awareness that shouldn't have been possible according to every expert who'd pronounced judgment on his condition. "I can feel the pedals," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of a miracle he was afraid to believe. "Of course you can," Grace replied matter-of-factly. "Your body has been healing for 3 years. You just stopped listening to it because the doctors told you it was broken beyond repair." Marcus tested the pedal response, applying gentle pressure that translated into subtle yaw movements of the helicopter's nose. The sensation wasn't perfect, more like feeling through thick gloves than direct contact, but it was undeniably real. Either he was experiencing the most elaborate hallucination of his life, or his medical team had been catastrophically wrong about the extent of his injuries. "Dr. Kane said complete spinal transection," Marcus said, still not quite able to process what he was experiencing. "No possibility of recovery." "Dr. Kane said a lot of things," Grace replied with the casual wisdom that had characterized all her observations. "Some of them were true. Some of them were what he needed to believe to live with himself." The cryptic comment lodged in Marcus's mind like a splinter, but before he could demand explanation, the helicopter's systems completed their startup cycle and demanded his full attention. The aircraft sat at the edge of readiness, rotors spinning at idle, waiting for a pilot with sufficient courage to commit to flight. Marcus checked the weather instruments, noting that the storm had indeed cleared to marginal but flyable conditions. Visibility was limited but adequate. Winds were gusty but manageable for an experienced pilot. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have hesitated to launch in such conditions. But these weren't normal circumstances. He was attempting something that violated every safety protocol he'd established since the accident. "Where are we going?" he asked Grace, still not quite believing he was seriously considering this flight. "Denver Children's Hospital," Grace replied without hesitation. "There are children there who need to see that broken doesn't mean defeated. They need to see that adults can be brave even when they're scared." The destination hit Marcus with unexpected emotional force. Denver Children's Hospital was where Lily would have been treated if she'd survived the crash, where other families were fighting battles he'd been spared only because his daughter had died too quickly for medical intervention. The thought of facing that environment, of seeing children who might remind him of his lost daughter, terrified him more than any mechanical challenge the helicopter might present. "I don't think I can handle seeing sick children," Marcus admitted, his hands trembling slightly on the controls. "You don't have to handle it," Grace said gently. "You just have to show up." "Sometimes that's all courage is. Showing up when everything inside you wants to run away." Marcus closed his eyes and tried to summon the decisive confidence that had once made him legendary in boardrooms full of skeptical investors. But that man had possessed legs that worked, and a daughter who laughed at his jokes, and a future that stretched endlessly forward. This man, broken, grieving, terrified, was attempting something that could easily end in catastrophic failure, witnessed by the entire city of Denver. What if I crash? The question escaped before he could stop it, carrying 3 years of accumulated fear in 4 simple words. Grace reached across the cockpit and placed her small hand over his on the collective control. Her touch was warm and steady, somehow conveying more reassurance than all the medical expertise and professional therapy he'd received since the accident. "Then you crash knowing you tried," she said simply. "Your daughter would rather have a father who died trying to live than one who lived trying to die." The brutal honesty of her assessment cut through his defenses like a scalpel. Marcus realized he'd been slowly killing himself through inaction and isolation, choosing gradual dissolution over the messier business of actually engaging with life. Grace was offering him a choice between certain spiritual death and possible physical death, and somehow the physical risk seemed preferable to the certainty of continued emotional numbness. Marcus advanced the throttles with movements that felt like muscle memory returning from a long dream. The helicopter responded with eager power, lifting smoothly off the hangar floor in defiance of gravity, medical opinion, and common sense. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Wheeler was airborne under his own control, master of a machine that translated his will into 3-dimensional freedom. The sensation of flight hit him with overwhelming intensity. Wind buffeted the aircraft as they cleared the hangar doors, and Marcus found his feet automatically adjusting the anti-torque pedals to maintain directional control. The movements felt rusty but functional, like speaking a language he hadn't used in years but never quite forgotten. Denver spread below them in a winter landscape of impossible beauty. Snow-covered rooftops caught the afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds, and the Rocky Mountains rose in the distance with majesty that made human struggles seem both insignificant and precious. Marcus had forgotten how flying changed perspective, literally and figuratively, lifting problems into context that revealed solutions invisible from ground level. "She loved this view," Marcus said, his voice barely audible over the turbine noise. Grace nodded, watching the city pass beneath them with the calm attention she brought to everything. "She's still with you up here. And she's proud of you for flying again." Marcus felt tears he'd been suppressing for months finally break free, streaming down his cheeks as he navigated through airspace he'd once commanded with casual confidence. The crying didn't impair his flying. If anything, it seemed to clear his vision, washing away 3 years of accumulated grief and self-pity that had clouded his judgment. Denver Children's Hospital appeared ahead, its distinctive architecture unmistakable among the city's medical complex. Marcus had avoided this part of town since the accident, unable to bear reminders of the medical intervention his daughter had never received. But now, approaching from altitude with a mission that transcended his personal pain, the hospital looked different, not like a symbol of loss, but like a beacon of hope for families still fighting battles he'd already lost. The landing pad was clear, medical personnel having been alerted to their unconventional arrival. Marcus executed the approach with surprising smoothness, his body remembering the delicate dance between collective and cyclic that translated forward motion into controlled descent. The skids touched concrete with barely a bump, testament to skills that had survived 3 years of disuse. As the rotors wound down to silence, Marcus sat in his pilot's seat feeling fundamentally changed, not cured. He understood that his physical limitations remained real, but transformed. He'd proven to himself that broken didn't mean defeated, that courage wasn't about fearlessness, but about acting despite fear. Grace unbuckled her harness and prepared to exit the aircraft, but before she could open her door, Marcus stopped her with a question that had been building since their first meeting. "Who are you, really?" he asked. "And don't tell me you're just a child who understands patterns." Children don't know intimate details about strangers' medical histories or speak with the wisdom of someone who's lived multiple lifetimes. Grace turned to face him fully for the first time since entering the helicopter, and in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the cockpit windows, Marcus saw something in her expression that made his breath catch. Not just wisdom beyond her years, but a specific kind of knowing that came from shared experience with profound loss. "My name is Grace Mitchell," she said quietly. "My mother is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a trauma psychologist who specializes in conversion disorders, psychological conditions that mimic physical disabilities. She's been studying your case for 3 years, trying to understand why some people recover from severe trauma while others remain trapped by it." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His miraculous encounters with this wise child hadn't been chance meetings. They'd been carefully orchestrated interventions designed by a mental health professional who understood that traditional therapy had failed where unorthodox methods might succeed. "So this was all planned," Marcus said, feeling the familiar bitterness that had sustained him through 3 years of disappointment. "The restaurant, the lessons, everything. Just another form of manipulation." "The methods were planned," Grace corrected gently. "The caring was real. My mother lost her son, my older brother, in Afghanistan 5 years ago. She understands what it feels like to lose a child, to blame yourself for not being able to protect them. When she heard about your case, she recognized something familiar." Marcus processed this information while staring at the hospital building where families were fighting battles he'd given up on. The revelation that his healing journey had been professionally orchestrated should have filled him with rage, but instead he felt something unexpected: gratitude. Whatever Dr. Mitchell's methods, they'd worked where traditional medicine had failed. "And you?" he asked Grace. "What's your story? What makes an 8-year-old girl wise enough to guide adults through trauma recovery?" Grace's composure cracked slightly, revealing the frightened child beneath the wise exterior. "I was in the Humvee when my brother died. I saw what happens when people you love don't come home. I had to learn how to keep living when part of me wanted to die with him. My mother helped me, and now I help other people the same way." The simple honesty of her explanation dissolved the last of Marcus's defensive anger. This child had faced loss comparable to his own and chosen healing over bitterness, growth over stagnation. Her wisdom hadn't come from supernatural sources, but from the most human experience of all, learning to love after loss. As they prepared to enter the hospital together, Marcus realized that the truth behind Grace's identity didn't diminish what she'd given him. She'd offered hope when he'd forgotten what it looked like, courage when he'd lost the will to try, and most importantly, the understanding that broken people could still choose to help other broken people heal. Emotional message for American seniors, 200 words. At 55, 68, or anywhere in between, how many dreams have you buried because someone told you it was too late or impossible? Marcus Wheeler believed the experts who said his walking days were over, just like many of us accept limitations that may not be as permanent as we think. We live in a culture that whispers, "Act your age," when our hearts still burn with unfulfilled possibilities. But what if the greatest adventures of your life are still waiting? What if that business you dreamed of starting, that relationship you thought was beyond repair, that creative pursuit you abandoned decades ago, could still become reality? Grace taught Marcus that broken doesn't mean defeated. It means you have a story worth telling and wisdom worth sharing. Your grandchildren don't need perfect grandparents. They need authentic ones who show them that courage has no expiration date. Every sunrise is God's reminder that it's never too late for a new beginning. Your wheelchair whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, doesn't define your destiny. The question isn't whether you're too old to start over. The question is, what dream have you been afraid to chase, and what would happen if you finally gave yourself permission to fly? Discussion questions. What dream did you abandon that still whispers to you in quiet moments? Have you ever been told you were too old for something that your heart still desires? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The children's ward at Denver General buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that marked shift changes in pediatric hospitals. Nurses moved between rooms with practiced efficiency, their colorful scrubs and gentle voices providing comfort in a place where comfort was precious currency. The helicopter landing had created enough excitement to draw small faces to windows, and word had spread quickly through the halls that something extraordinary was happening on the roof. Marcus transferred from his pilot seat to his wheelchair with movements that no longer felt like defeat. The chair remained a necessity, but it had transformed from symbol of limitation to tool of mobility. Grace walked beside him as they made their way through automatic doors that opened onto corridors filled with the complex mixture of hope and heartbreak that defined children's hospitals everywhere. The first child they encountered was Tommy Rodriguez, 7 years old with legs encased in metal braces following a car accident that had shattered his femurs 3 months earlier. He sat in the physical therapy room, tears streaming down his face as he struggled with walking exercises that seemed impossible to master. His therapist, a patient woman named Linda, offered encouragement that fell on ears deafened by frustration and fear. "I can't do it," Tommy sobbed, collapsing into his wheelchair with the dramatic finality that only children could achieve. "I'll never walk right again. I'll never play soccer. I'll never be normal." Grace approached the boy with the same calm assurance she'd shown Marcus, her small hand reaching out to touch Tommy's wheelchair with gentle familiarity. "This chair isn't your enemy," she said softly. "It's just giving your legs time to remember how strong they are. Mr. Wheeler used to think his chair was a prison too, until he learned it was actually a launching pad." Marcus felt every eye in the therapy room focus on him with the intensity of spotlights. Parents, staff, and children all studied this stranger who'd arrived by helicopter and now sat at eye level with their struggles. The attention should have been overwhelming, but instead Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the desire to be useful to someone other than himself. "Tommy," Marcus said, rolling his chair closer to the boy's position, "what do you miss most about walking?" The question seemed to surprise Tommy, who'd clearly expected the kind of hollow encouragement adults usually offered children facing impossible challenges. "Running," he answered after a moment's consideration. "I miss running to places I wanted to go instead of having other people push me there." Marcus nodded, understanding the distinction with painful clarity. "The chair takes you places," he said, "but it doesn't let you choose how fast you get there or exactly which path you take. It makes you depend on other people's decisions about your movement." "Exactly." Tommy's response carried the relief of someone whose experience had finally been understood rather than dismissed. "Everyone keeps telling me I should be grateful I can move at all, but they don't understand that it's not the same." "It's not the same," Marcus agreed, "but it's also not permanent. Your legs are healing, and healing takes time that feels too long when you're the one waiting. I forgot that my legs might heal because I stopped believing they could." "Don't make my mistake." Grace moved to the parallel bars where Tommy had been attempting his walking exercises, her small hands gripping the rails with surprising strength. "Show him," she said to Marcus, and something in her tone carried absolute certainty that he would understand what she meant. Marcus looked at the parallel bars. standard physical therapy equipment designed to provide support for patients relearning to walk. He hadn't used similar equipment since those first terrible weeks after the accident, when physical therapists had gently but firmly explained that his efforts were futile given the extent of his spinal damage. The memory of that failure still carried the power to make his chest tight with anxiety. "Grace, I can't," he said quietly, hoping she wouldn't push him beyond his capabilities in front of an audience of vulnerable children. "You can," she replied with the matter-of-fact tone that had characterized all her impossible requests. "You've been walking in your mind for 3 days. Now you just need to let your body remember what your mind already knows." The physical therapy room fell silent, except for the soft hum of fluorescent lighting and the distant sounds of hospital activity. Tommy watched with the intense focus children brought to moments that might contain magic, while the adults present seemed suspended between skepticism and hope. Marcus engaged his wheelchair brakes and positioned himself at one end of the parallel bars. The transfer from chair to standing position required upper body strength he'd maintained despite 3 years of limited mobility. But the real challenge would be convincing his legs to bear weight they hadn't supported since the accident. With movements that felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air, Marcus gripped the parallel bars and pulled himself to standing position. His legs trembled with the effort of supporting body weight they'd forgotten how to carry, but they held. More importantly, he could feel them holding, not with the full sensation he'd once known, but with enough awareness to maintain balance and control. "Holy shit," whispered one of the teenage patients, earning sharp looks from nearby staff, but perfectly expressing what everyone in the room was thinking. Marcus took his first step in 3 years. It was awkward, uncertain, requiring the support of the parallel bars to maintain balance, but it was undeniably a step. His right foot moved forward 6 inches, followed by his left in a movement that defied every medical opinion he'd received since the accident. Tommy rolled his wheelchair closer, his eyes wide with the kind of wonder that only children could fully experience. "You're walking," he breathed. "You're actually walking." "Not very well," Marcus admitted, taking another careful step that required enormous concentration to execute. "But I'm moving forward under my own power, and that's something I thought I'd never do again." The room erupted in spontaneous applause from patients, parents, and staff who'd witnessed something that challenged their understanding of what recovery looked like. But Marcus barely heard the celebration. His entire focus was concentrated on the simple miracle of placing one foot in front of the other while his brain processed sensations he'd been told were impossible. Grace appeared at his elbow, her small presence providing moral support that somehow made the physical challenge more manageable. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Terrifying," Marcus answered honestly, "like I'm going to fall at any second. But also alive. More alive than I've felt in 3 years, Doctor." Sarah Mitchell chose that moment to enter the physical therapy room, her professional composure barely containing obvious emotion as she watched her daughter and patient achieve something she'd hoped for but never quite believed possible. At 54, Dr. Mitchell carried herself with the confident authority of someone who'd spent decades helping trauma survivors reclaim their lives, but her eyes held the particular mixture of pride and amazement that came from witnessing breakthrough moments. "Mom," Grace said simply, acknowledging her mother's presence without taking her attention away from Marcus's halting progress along the parallel bars. Marcus paused in his walking to study the woman who'd orchestrated his unconventional recovery. Dr. Mitchell was smaller than he'd imagined, with graying blonde hair and kind eyes that seemed capable of seeing through defensive barriers to the wounded person beneath. She wore simple clothes rather than medical attire, and her presence felt more like a favorite teacher than intimidating doctor. "Dr. Mitchell," Marcus said, his voice carrying questions he didn't know how to formulate. I have so many things I need to ask you." "Later," she replied gently. "Right now, you have an audience of children who need to see you complete this walk. They need to understand that recovery isn't about returning to exactly who you were before. It's about discovering who you can become despite what you've lost." Marcus looked around the therapy room at faces that reflected his own journey in miniature. Children dealing with injuries, disabilities, and medical challenges that would define their paths forward. Some would recover completely, others would adapt to permanent changes, but all of them needed to see that adults could face impossible circumstances with courage rather than despair. With renewed determination, Marcus completed his journey along the parallel bars, covering perhaps 20 feet in distance that felt like crossing a continent. When he reached the end, he stood gripping the final rail with hands that shook from exertion and emotion, looking back at the path he'd traveled with the amazement of someone who'd just walked on water. Tommy had followed alongside in his wheelchair, serving as unofficial cheerleader for every step. "Can you teach me to do that?" he asked, with the directness that made children such effective communicators. "I can teach you what I learned," Marcus replied, settling back into his own wheelchair with muscles that ached in ways he'd almost forgotten were possible. Mostly that healing happens faster when you focus on helping someone else heal. Your body remembers how to be strong when your heart remembers how to care about something bigger than your own problems. Grace moved between the two wheelchairs with the satisfied expression of someone whose work was nearing completion. "Tommy, would you like to hear about the pattern that connects everything?" she asked. "About how helping others teaches your own body to remember what it's capable of?" As Grace began explaining her philosophy to an audience of fascinated children, Marcus found himself studying Dr. Mitchell with the analytical mind that had built his business empire. This woman had understood something about trauma recovery that traditional medicine missed, that healing required more than fixing broken parts. It required reconnecting people with their capacity for hope, purpose, and connection to others. "Your methods are unconventional," he said quietly, positioning his wheelchair where they could speak without disturbing Grace's impromptu lesson. "Unconventional but effective," Dr. Mitchell replied. "Traditional therapy works for some patients, but others need approaches that engage their whole person rather than just treating symptoms. You needed to rediscover your strength through using it to help someone else, and Grace needed to process her own trauma by helping adults remember how to be brave." Marcus watched his young teacher demonstrate walking techniques to children who hung on her every word, and he realized that healing wasn't a solitary journey, but a collaborative art form that worked best when wounded people helped other wounded people find their way forward.